We're having the numbers starting to climb now, so we're just going to take a few minutes and we'll get started. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our first offshore wind webinar series we're calling Learning from the Experts. My name is Greg Lampman. I manage NYSERDA's environmental research program, a component of which is makes up the NYSERDA's offshore wind team. I'm pleased to be joined here today by Luke Feinberg with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. But before we turn it over to Luke, who will be giving the presentation, I just want to give a little background on our series and the protocols for the webinar today. Can I get the next slide, please? I want to first call your attention to the email address on the bottom of the slide. Sal Graven is here to help with technical problems. If you're experiencing some challenges right now with the webinar, or if you run into them along the way, you want to just make note of Sal's email address and reach out to him. He'll get you squared away as quickly as possible. I also want to note that this webinar series is being recorded and the presentations will be made available at the website here. It is important to recognize that it takes a few days to get these slides turned around into something that can be posted on our webpage. So if you're patient, these should be available early next week. You will also note that members of the public who are signing on to this webinar are being muted upon entry, but we will have time at the end of this presentation to take questions and comments from participants here. So you're encouraged to use the Q&A function and submit your questions through that process. We'll be reviewing those and asking those questions of Luke at the end of his presentation. I'm sorry. Can I get the next slide, please? So as many of you know, New York State has been working to cost effectively and responsibly advance 9 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2035. Offshore wind is a critical component in achieving the state's goals of 70% renewable sources of electricity by 2030 and zero emissions electricity by 2040. In the course of our work, we come across stakeholders who have interests in certain aspects, technical aspects of offshore wind, or in the processes by which offshore wind is developed. Some of these questions require more time to answer than we have in our interactions with them, and we thought it appropriate to bring together a webinar series that can bring experts to the topic and present on them so that the public can better understand the technologies that are being used and the processes that are being used to advance cost-effective and responsible development of offshore wind energy. NYSERDA is going to endeavor to bring experts into this process who may or may not necessarily represent the opinions of New York State or of NYSERDA, but who can provide unbiased information to the public so they can better understand the opportunities associated with offshore wind. Can I get the next slide, please? So going forward, we will be endeavoring to select experts based on expertise. If you have an interest in providing an expert or introducing a topic, you can send an email to offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov. And again, I just want to note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter, not necessarily NYSERDA or the state of New York. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Luke Feinberg. Luke is a program specialist with the Office of Renewable Energy Programs at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. He is responsible for the coordination of all renewable energy activities offshore New York, including leasing in the New York Bight, and he supports coordination efforts offshore Massachusetts and the Gulf of Maine. Prior to his work at BOEM, Luke worked in the Wind Energy Technologies Office at the Department of Energy, and prior to joining federal service, Luke was a consultant with a private environmental company in the Boston area. I think it's interesting to note that Luke found his way into offshore wind through a short career as a tall ship sailor in the Atlantic, Great Lakes, and the Pacific. And it seems that his experience there in working with wind energy to move vessels has translated to his interest in wind energy to move turbines. With that, I will turn it over to Luke to take us through the presentation. Welcome, Luke.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate the introduction there. Sal, do you mind just giving me the opportunity to share my slides? Okay, hopefully you can see my cover slide here. Is that correct?
It is. You're looking good, Luke.
All right, great. All right, so again, my name is Luke Feinberg, and I very much appreciate the opportunity today to explain a little bit about the renewable energy planning and leasing processes and give you a taste of what that looks like. Hopefully you'll step away from this presentation with a better understanding of what that process is and what the future steps may look like for processes in your regions. So first of all, what is BOEM and sort of where did we come from? Well, originally the authority for BOEM comes from the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, and in that act it states that the Outer Continental Shelf is a vital national resource that should be subject to expeditious and orderly development in accordance with environmental safeguards. In 2005, the Energy Policy Act amended that original Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act to include energy from sources other than oil and gas. And that's where we come in with renewable energy. So BOEM is active throughout the United States, in Alaska on the Outer Continental Shelf out there, the Pacific, where activities are focused on oil and gas and planning for renewable energy activities, the Gulf of Mexico. I think most are familiar with the majority of the oil and gas activities there, and then the Atlantic, where we'll be focusing on renewable energy. So before we dive in, let's talk a little bit about the program by the numbers, so to speak. Our regulations were promulgated in 2009, and since that time, we've completed 8 competitive lease sales, and those have all been on the East Coast of the United States. We have 16 active leases, also on the East Coast of the United States. We do have some planning activities on the West Coast and the Gulf of Mexico. There are some major plans that a lessee is required, which we'll talk about, required to submit, which we'll talk about in a minute. One of those is a site assessment plan. We've approved 10 site assessment plans, as well as 2 general activities and research plans. The big piece where the rubber hits the road is a construction and operations plan. And that is really where a lessee will explain what exactly they plan to do and propose on the Outer Continental Shelf. And that's where the details are that we can get into our analysis. So we have 13 plans currently under review on the Atlantic coast and anticipate another 3 of them in the next 12 months. We've also issued several guidance documents, 10 to be specific, and those are to inform our stakeholders about the details of our processes and hopefully in an effort to smooth things out as we move forward. There are 7 different areas that we have under consideration for leasing, and like I said, these range from the Atlantic with the Gulf of Maine, the New York Bight, Mid-Atlantic and Carolinas, to the Gulf of Mexico, offshore California, Oregon, and Hawaii. And lastly, 2020, while it was a challenging year for most, was an exciting one in the offshore wind industry in that it was the first year that we had steel in federal waters, and that occurred offshore Virginia with the first project, and I'll show it here, is the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Pilot Project. So again, that is a pilot project, 2 turbines, and that'll hopefully inform a larger development in the future. But this slide here is just to really give folks a sense of what the pipeline looks like. And there's a lot going on. A lot of projects that are being worked on by a wide variety of diverse developers from expertise around the world, particularly from experiences in Europe. And you can see that there's a lot of activity from now until 2030 and beyond, primarily on the East Coast here and up and down the East Coast, not necessarily specifically focused in one area or another. So how do we get there? How do we get to a point where you have such a large pipeline, and what does the future look like? Well, it really follows this process. And before I go into many of the details, it's important to know that this process, the foundation, is really based on the best available science and engaging with stakeholders to understand the equities and concerns of ocean space, and to make sure we're doing so in a way that really is stewarding the resource in the best manner possible. So the process that we have outlined to accomplish that includes 4 main stages or phases: planning and analysis, leasing, site assessment, and the construction and operations. So for the beginning of this presentation, we'll just focus in on the beginning stage here, right? So planning, analysis, and leasing. What does that look like in a little bit more detail? Well, it starts with think of this as a winnowing process. So the goal is to try and identify an area you can offer for sale. And it starts out with a larger process, is narrowed down through consultation with stakeholders, federal partners, and other users of the OCS. An area is identified to offer for sale, or in this case, wind energy areas, and further documents are developed in order to ultimately end up with an auction. So these slides here will show you a little bit of a better understanding, hopefully a better understanding of what that process is. The first step is an optional step, so to speak. It's not something that is required in our regulations, but it's part of the toolbox we have to approach planning. And it really is essentially drawing an area on the Outer Continental Shelf as a planning area. So it's a high-level screening, an initial identification of areas that might be suitable. So are there areas that, for example, we don't have jurisdiction? Those wouldn't necessarily be included as part of our planning process. And for information, those are areas that are between 0 and 3 miles offshore. On the East Coast, we generally do not have jurisdiction until we get to 3 miles out to 200 nautical miles in the exclusive economic zone. The next step is, and this is a step that is formalized in our regulations but is optional, is a request for interest. And this is really a request kind of in the early stages of the process. So it's one that is published in the Federal Register, and it's used to determine if there's competitive interest for offshore wind energy on the Outer Continental Shelf. And the way our regulations are written are kind of a default to a competitive process, right? So that's assuming that we have more than one person interested in potentially developing offshore wind energy. So if you have a situation where you go out with a request for interest and you determine that there's only one company or a qualified person that's interested, we do have a process to lease something uncompetitively or non-competitive process. We typically are finding that given the interest of offshore wind, especially on the Atlantic, we are usually in a competitive process. So as we'll talk about a little bit later than New York Bight, we went straight to a call area. And as you can see by the solid outline of that box, it is a required step in our process. And that is generally a smaller area than the planning area or the RFI. And it's an area we ask for special consideration and analysis. So are there things out there that we should know about and thinking about offshore wind to account for when talking about future development? There's certain conditions in the area we need to know about. And it really gives a sense to the community of what areas we're considering for leasing. The other important piece of this call for information and nominations is the second part, is nomination. So we are asking the development community to tell us a little bit about what they think of the area that we are outlining here. So specifically, are there specific pieces of that that would be more appealing to develop or not, and why? And that's also used to help determine if there's competitive interest should you not move forward with a RFI in the beginning of the process. So once you get a call for information out there, you have a public comment period, and you digest all the information you receive, BOEM will come out with a wind energy area. And so what is a wind energy area? On a technical level, it is really the portion of the Outer Continental Shelf that BOEM has identified for our NEPA analysis, which in this case is going to be an environmental assessment. So it's the outer bounds of the areas we're looking at for environmental assessment. Traditionally, the program has identified a wind energy area through this deconflicting process, and the bounds of that wind energy area have been the area that we've offered for sale. So for example, we would take this whole blue box and offer that whole blue box for sale, and that would become the lease area that we move forward with. It's important to understand that that's one way we could go, but we could also carve that up even more and have lease areas within a wind energy area. So as you can see, we're always going down and down and down and down and winnowing down. There's not really an opportunity to expand back out. That's not the intention of the process. But for example, if we designate a wind energy area and there are varying degrees of conflict within that wind energy area, or we learn more information between the time we issue a wind energy area and when we issue a proposed sale notice that identifies the lease areas, we can use that information to continue to winnow things down. So that's a little bit in the abstract of what the process looks like. So I'm going to take some time now to go through a more detailed example, which I hope is piques the interest of many folks on this webinar because we're focusing on the New York Bight. So first, let's get our orientation. So this is the shore of New Jersey, Long Island, and the coast of New York. These shapes down here are existing wind energy areas, or actually existing lease areas that BOEM has offered. Offshore New Jersey, this is the lease area that's currently occupied by Equinor in the Empire Wind Project. And then we have leases here offshore Rhode Island, Massachusetts. So in 2017, thereabouts, we received interest from the state of New York, and specifically NYSERDA, to take a look at additional leasing areas. So where could you lease out here? We do have the benefit of having a lot of great science information and stakeholder engagement in the previous area identification processes. And so we didn't necessarily feel that we needed to start with a planning area or an RFI. So really, we looked at this and thought about, well, what should we consider when we're actually developing the call for information nominations, right? So that's that first step that's required in the process. And so NYSERDA sent us these shapes and said, here are the areas you should consider, and really it's the areas within the green shapes. So we took those and applied a few factors to them. And this was in the latter part of 2017. And we'll go through some of the details here. So these are really areas that we felt were kind of go, no go, or hard things that would not be compatible with offshore wind energy. And the first one I'll point out are existing maritime traffic. Maritime traffic, either traffic separation schemes, which are these dark pink pieces here, or fairways and precautionary zones. And those are things that are charted. And you know, the port of New York and New Jersey is one of the largest in the United States, if not the East Coast. And there's a whole lot of traffic there. And so we want to make sure that any sort of development that is proposed or any lease areas that are offered are done so in accordance with accounting for what that traffic is, and not only what it was, what it is, but what it may be in the future. So areas that were charted, we stayed away from and removed those from consideration. You'll see here also a gold or orange line. That gold-orange line is 15 nautical miles from the coast. And that was a buffer that we decided to implement that was also supported by the state of New York, and that's really to do a number of things. One, there is a lot of activity as we get closer to the coast, right? So whether it's recreational boating, recreational fishing, commercial fishing, as well as a higher concentration of marine and avian activity. But it's also, the closer to shore you are, the potential for visual impacts is increased as well. So that's why, in part, why we have that 15 nautical mile buffer. So that's sort of the western boundary. When you go towards the east, we discussed here, there's this blue line, and this blue line is a 60-meter depth contour. And the reason that was decided upon was it's sort of the agreed upon depth at which a fixed foundation for offshore wind becomes infeasible from an economic standpoint. So once you get that deep, it starts to become more the territory of incorporating a floating foundation. So we decided to exclude areas that were deeper than 60 meters. And you'll see here that that depth contour kind of shoots up near shore here, and that's the Hudson River Canyon, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. And that area there, specifically where my pointer is here, is an interesting one in which you have very deep waters coming up closer to shallower waters, and a lot of upwelling activity happening here. And that's combined with more primary production, more marine activity, which then leads to more fisheries activities. And it's also a zone in which we have a lot of vessels that are leaving or coming from the port of New York and New Jersey and heading out to sea, right? So even though these traffic separation schemes here do have a terminus, it doesn't mean that vessels that are traveling here just disappear, right? So they've got to go somewhere. So we extended those, or provided a de facto extension, both the 5 nautical mile extension at the entrance and exit, and also this 30 nautical mile extension at the exit here, and decided not to account for those for the call area. And the last things I'll highlight here, this big red area here was an area that the DoD had previously told us, the Department of Defense had told us was one that was not compatible with wind energy. And also an area here, which is a scallop rotational area that was reserved for fisheries management purposes. So all that is to say, what does that look like? Well, we summarized that in April of 2018 and released these call areas. So this is the area within blue, and said these are areas we're interested in learning more about to inform our leasing process, and ask specific questions and also nominations from development community, what they would like to see, what areas were better than others in the New York Bight. So as a result of that, we issued draft wind energy areas, which are the areas we see in green here, to the task force in November of 2018. And so how do we get from these call areas to the draft areas? Well, there's certainly a lot to consider, as I think many can appreciate. There really is no acre or even square inch of unconflicted space on the Outer Continental Shelf, specifically in the New York Bight. And we do our best to try and balance those needs of the existing stakeholders and also potential future stakeholders to determine where these wind energy areas could be. So the first piece I'll talk about is nominations. So these are areas in which development community told us they prefer to develop a project. So if you look at these red blocks here, one of those blocks that's red means that there were 5 developers that overlapped each other in that area and thought it was a good place to lease. This map is a little bit misleading in that the areas that do not have any coloring to them or nomination density, it doesn't mean that developers aren't interested, right? So the packages that were submitted with these shapes included narratives that said something along the lines of, we are interested in any development in the New York Bight, but if you're going to ask us where you want us to go, we'll draw some shapes as well. So you'll note that these areas in red, for example, that were of highest density from a developer's perspective, were not included as a draft wind energy area because of other factors. Some of those other factors include fishing activity. So what you're looking at here is what's called a relative use index, and it's built based on traffic data, so AIS data. So you can see it kind of clearly shows where these traffic separation schemes and fairways are located, as well as landings and the value of those landings. So if an area, it generally has reported very high value from a fishery standpoint, there's a lot of money being made here or in a specific area, that'll show up here as well. And this is a relative use. So the areas that are hotter are areas, or more towards that red color spectrum, are areas that are more valuable. So from a fisheries perspective, they're areas that are trafficked more and bring in more revenue. Versus the areas towards the cooler side of the spectrum, doesn't mean there's not fishing there. It just means that relative to other areas, there is less fishing activity. And this is a snapshot in time, I believe based on a few years worth of data. And so we recognize too that this is, again, a snapshot, and it doesn't necessarily indicate where future fishing activities may occur either. But I think you can notice that we did make an effort to identify areas that were towards that lower end of the spectrum from a relative use index perspective. And that was another large piece that helped inform our process. And then we go to traffic data in general, right? So this is the year 2016. You take all your vessels that have AIS transponders and you turn those on and you see where the density is. So each one of these little tracks out here is an individual vessel at some point in 2016. And as you get closer to the harbor, these are tens of thousands of vessels throughout the year. So we wanted to make sure that we were taking into account areas of high traffic, some of these being brighter than others, and accounting for, again, you can see where these zones are for designated traffic. And also, it's interesting to note on this particular graphic, how much traffic does occur in that near coastal zone. So like I said, we're thinking about what's happened in the past, what's happening now, but what also might happen in the future. And the U.S. Coast Guard has done some great work to try and predict and utilize data and consultation with stakeholders to figure out, well, where could we potentially facilitate trade and maritime traffic by designated future fairways or lanes in order to maintain safety. So they've proposed this tug and towing lane. So a lot of the folks that are coming or going to the Delaware Bay area up to New England will take the opportunity to cross through the New York Bight versus sticking to shore. And the idea here is to try and channel that traffic into a more predictable manner. And it's pretty clear that that path or the proposed tug tow lane does overlap with some of the proposed wind energy areas. And that's something that we continue to talk with Coast Guard about. And another very important stakeholder here is the Department of Defense. So as I said, in the early stages, we had this circular type shape here, which is primarily kind of for submarine activity. And then we have this area here that the DoD suggested was something that would not be compatible with wind energy. And this is largely due to activities associated with Marine Corps helicopter refueling exercises. And we're also working with the DoD to try to understand what space they need and try and make sure that they can continue to operate and conduct their missions as necessary. So that's how we got to November of 2018. I'm sure many of you are very curious to know what it looks like in March of 2021. And I can say that an update will be provided in the near future. Nothing I can disclose right now, but we look forward to your future input as we progress through the leasing process in the New York Bight. Okay, so that was an example of the earlier parts of the process, right? We've got to wind energy areas or pretty close to wind energy areas. So what does it look like when you go to this second piece? Well, it's really two main paths that are being followed here. The first is this leasing document development. And that's really getting everything in order to end up with an auction and get a lessee on board. And that is highlighted by the proposed sale notice and the final sale notice. Concurrently with that, you have the environmental assessment process and public involvement. It's important to note that, again, as the foundation of this process is public involvement and utilizing best available science. So we do have public comment periods associated with these Federal Register notices, whether it's requests for interest, a call for information nominations. We do have a 60-day comment period that is outlined in our regulations for a proposed sale notice. And there often are comment periods associated with an environmental assessment. So what is the environmental assessment itself? Well, as some of you are familiar, it's part of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And the focus of that assessment is really to understand what are the environmental effects associated with leasing. And those are broken down into two main categories. The first are site characterization activities. So that's the biological, geological, geotechnical, and archaeological surveys. And those are done through a variety of mediums, as well as site assessment activities. And this is really assessing the conditions on the site from a development perspective in some ways, which is the meteorological and oceanographic buoy deployment or tower. So a lot of the surveys for site characterization happens aboard onshore off of vessels through a variety of medium. And then we're talking about in the site assessment world, traditionally you had wind meteorological towers that were developed and installed on site to measure wind at the hub height of a turbine. As things have advanced, buoys have come out and be able to use a LiDAR system to do that without the expense of installing and impacting the seabed with a tower. So that's the environmental assessment in a nutshell there. And then we have the first major document in these leasing document development, and that's a proposed sale notice, or a PSN. So what are the major parts of that? Well, really, that outlines, the document of the proposed sale notice actually outlines what we are proposing for leasing. So the actual areas that might be offered for sale in the future. It includes the fiscal terms for the leases we'd offer. Our regulatory structure has a relatively broad toolbox, if you will, of ways that we could auction things off. And so in this proposed sale notice, we'll provide the details and the format by which we plan to perform that auction. The auction itself is really an auction for the rights to enter into a contract with the government. So from the lessee's perspective as a developer and the lessor perspective as BOEM. So the proposed sale notice will include the lease and the proposed lease terms for that. And we utilize those lease terms to ensure that we are meeting our mandate and also making sure that we are able to keep up to date and incorporate any terms or conditions that some of our partners may find necessary. If you're a developer, the proposed sale notice is your last opportunity to submit qualification information to participate in the sale. So if that's something you're interested in, there's a series of qualifications you need to provide from a legal, technical, and financial standpoint. And if we do choose to run an auction that utilizes non-monetary factors, so anything other than cash, we will outline that in the proposed sale notice as well. And the auction process itself is not, can be challenging at times, depending how complex it is. So we typically hold an auction seminar for potential bidders, and that will be held at a future date in the process. And like I said, the proposed sale notice gets published in the Federal Register, and it's open for 60 days of public comments. So that means anybody can go online, write a letter and submit a comment, and those comments will get processed, and we'll use the information we gain from those comments in order to inform the final sale notice. And that's really a key part of our process, and just want to make sure people are aware that that's always going to be available as part of the proposed sale notice process. And Typically, we will highlight certain questions that we're grasping with, or and again, we're sort of following that winnowing idea. So we'll provide the bounds of what we're considering. So and ask questions about what may be best for this particular situation, and seek feedback, and that has really been important in the past, and I think will continue to be as we refine our proposals and get down to that final sale notice. So as I mentioned, the final sale notice is really that opportunity that we button everything up and we say, here's the sale date, here are your requirements, here's the term and conditions, and it's sort of the decisions that we've made as a result of being informed by the proposed sale notice process. We've had bid deposits that are required to participate in the auction, and that's been about $450,000 per bidder. That it also will include a list of the final bidders that are available for auction. So if you've qualified and you make the final sale notice, that means that you can qualify and participate in the auction. Like I said, the auction process, we want to make sure that goes right. I think we've done well in the past, and we'll hold a mock auction with the qualified bidders to make sure people understand how the process works, and then we hold our auction. So our auction process is not quite like eBay. It's a little unique. And this is a schematic to show you generally how it works, and we'll go through a quick example just to give you a taste of it. I think it was developed with a forward-looking eye towards a pandemic or a COVID potential, because it is something that is online. It is anonymous. You can participate from anywhere in the world, barring you have a computer and the right security setup. So we have bidders. We obviously need more than two, but it can accommodate quite a few bidders. They talk to a server. We have an auction manager who manages the contracts and basically is the one behind the scenes, and then BOEM part of that process to inform some of the decisions that are made throughout the auction day. And of course, that's backed up by a server to make sure we can run the process smoothly. So let's go through a quick example just to give you a sense of what it looks like. The bidding occurs over multiple rounds, and during each round, BOEM's asking price is raised, and the bidder indicates whether they'd be willing to pay for that area or pay for the amount for that area. And then when only one bidder is willing to pay for the price that we've asked, or has the highest exit bid, which I'll talk about, that bidder is the winner, or in this case, the provisional winner. So let's say that we have round one and the asking price is $100. We have 4 bidders. Each of those bidders says, yes, I am willing to pay $100 for that lease area. I'm in. BOEM will then come back and say, okay, we've got 4 bidders in. We should raise the price again. They'll determine how much to raise it by and say we want it to raise to $150. Well, in this case here, $150, that's something that bidder forward cannot really move forward with. They don't think that the value of whatever we're bidding on is that high, so they bow out. They do not submit a bid, and we just have bidders 1, 2, and 3 to move forward with. But since you have more than one bidder, you continue going forward. The BOEM and the auction manager will increase the price, the asking price again, to $200 in this case. And here we have it just a little too rich for bidder number 1. So they have bowed out at this point. So because you still have 2 live bidders in bidder 2 and bidder 3, you continue the auction. And in this case, we'll keep it simple and increase by $250. Increase by $50 again to $250. And here we find that bidder 2 still likes that, but bidder 3 thinks it's a little overpriced. And so as a result of that, you have a provisional winner here of bidder 2 winning the auction. That's a simplified example. There is another wrinkle to this. This is a format of a very simple ascending bid auction, you can submit an exit bid. So what if, for example, you thought that, that you were bidder one and you're willing to pay 150, but you're not willing to pay 200, but you're willing to pay something in between. Instead of just submitting that $200 bid, you can submit an exit bid of $190, right? Something in between that. And in this case, that didn't really matter for bidder number one because you had two other bidders that submitted the full price. But at the end, this did matter. Neither bidder number two nor bidder number three were willing to pay the $250. So they each submitted an exit bid. And they said, my maximum willingness to pay is 240 and 225. And I should note that this is all blind to these bidders. So they don't know who the other bidders are, and they don't see what the other activity is, so to speak. The only information they get when a new round is open is the asking price and the number of bidders remaining. So if we go to round 3, for example, they'll know that the asking price is $200. And at that point, there were 3 bidders available, 1, 2, and 3. And they don't know who they are or anything like that. And that's really set up to try and avoid any collusion activities or anything like that. So that's just an example of the auction process. And again, it's pretty simplified. This is a summary of the sales we've had to date, and you can see that things have changed quite drastically over time. Our first sale in 2013, 2 lease areas were offered and had a relatively healthy bid amount there, or total bid amount. But as you move through, you'll see that some leases, like these offshore Massachusetts in 2015, did not go for that much money. And you know, it's still the same acreage of the Outer Continental Shelf, or it's the same plot of land, so to speak. But I'd say the major changes that can account for some of these differences in prices is the ability that the developers foresaw to sell power. So in some cases, for example, I believe in Maryland, in this case in 2014, there was a mechanism that Maryland was utilizing in order to purchase power from a potential development. Part of the reason why this went up, and as you see in 2016, many of you can remember, we had this really landmark sale of $42 million. Our previous high was $5 million, so many multiples higher in New York, and that is for the Equinor Empire Wind lease, and that was really driven by intense competition and the ability to potentially, more likely ability to purchase power from the state, and that continued to increase as you moved to December of 2018, when you had this record of $135 million each for 3 lease areas offshore Massachusetts. And it's very interesting to note that these 3 areas were derived from these 2 areas, which didn't sell in January of 2015. So you went from a value of 0 to 135 million in a few years. So I think it gives folks a sense of where things are going in the offshore wind industry, and certainly headed in the right direction if you're interested in seeing offshore wind being developed. So that is my presentation today. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I hope that folks have a better understanding of how our process works, maybe a grasp of what an example looks like, and a more informed process and more informed stakeholders to understand where we may be going in the future. So I'll stop there, and
thank you, Luke. That was a really exciting overview of the process that BOEM uses, both in its decision making as well as the mechanics. One of the best overviews I've seen. So really appreciate that, and glad we got it on tape so that we can make it available to others as well. So we have received a few questions, but I want to remind everyone that if you have questions for Luke, please feel free to submit them via the chat function, and we'll try to get to them as they come in. So the first question, and I've heard this from stakeholders over time, is why are the DoD wind exclusion areas are not viable for wind development? And I think this goes to a question that we hear often, which is, there are some things fixed in space, like fairways and transit lanes, and other things are potentially movable, such as a helicopter exercise by the military. So one of the questioners is interested in why they are considered exclusion areas.
That's a great question. It really depends on what you're talking about and where you're at, and it also depends on, the values of the administration at the time. So I can speak to the New York Bight, and that specifically the area with Hudson South. You have activities coming out of a joint base in New Jersey where you have Marine Corps helicopter refueling exercises that are happening in midair. So those are some heavyweight lifting helicopters that are being refueled by some, I think, just larger aircraft, and that has to happen at a certain elevation in order to make sure that that's safe. And it's not that they have to use one particular piece of airspace. It's that they, a few years ago, there wasn't a restriction, right? And then the areas offshore New Jersey were leased and they couldn't use those anymore. So I think the Department of Defense, and I certainly don't speak for them, but they want to make sure that they're able to operate and conduct their mission as necessary, and want to make sure that there's space in the future to do that. And so they're working with us to develop what those areas are that they would need in order to continue to meet their mission.
Gotcha. Thank you. On a slightly different topic, considering adding LiDAR buoy deployment to the categorical exclusion list?
I believe that a categorical exclusion is already included for actually, that's probably something I probably should not speak to. I think that's something we can get back to you about in terms of the EA and the environmental impacts of that.
How many years is a lease last? So when they execute on the lease, what's the duration of that lease?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, it depends on the lease. So if you go to the most recent sale we had in 2018 offshore Massachusetts, you have leases that have an operating term. And so that the important thing to note is that the clock starts when your construction operation plan is submitted and approved. It's the approval of the construction operation plan. And in that case, it's 33 years. So it really starts, the operating term starts before you have something constructed. Other leases have a 25-year operating term. There is a clause that does allow you to renegotiate that operations term, and that's something that we've had interested in the past, but the way that it's framed is sort of intended that you've been operating for a while, able to show you've been able to do it in a proper manner, and then would re-up that operations term, so to speak. But that is something that we're always looking for input on in terms of, what is the proper operations term. We do recognize that some of these facilities, the lives are getting longer. And especially with some of the sales that happened in the UK, we're talking about 60-year operations terms to account for one recycling or repowering of a plant. Those are important decisions we're always seeking input on.
All right, and if a developer fails to move forward in a timely manner, can the lease be expired or returned to BOEM?
It can be.
And leases can additionally be traded. I'm looking for confirmation on that one, sold or traded.
That's correct. Yeah, we have quite a lot of activity in that sort of lease reassignment with companies either being bought or sold or joined into a joint venture. So that is something that can happen.
Shifting gears again a little bit, you mentioned distance from shore or avian risks associated with distance from shore, but can you discuss a little bit how the siting process incorporates potential threats to birds, bats, and marine mammals?
So that's a key part of our process, and something that, because it's so specific to the operations that you would be proposing, there's sort of two levels. There's one level that says, is there critical habitat, for example, that you shouldn't even consider operating or proposing wind energy area. And that, if we find those critical habitats, those are taken off the table in the beginning. But when you're talking about the impacts at an individual level from a wind farm itself, those are really assessed during the construction operation plan review and the environmental impact statement.
So how long does the leasing document development and ultimately sale component of the process normally take? It's a timeline question on the leasing side.
Yep. Yeah, no, I wish there was a normal. Unfortunately, that timeline does tend to vary a little bit. I'd say that if you, going back to our slides, we say it's about a year and a half or so for the leasing development. But the end goal is not on a timeline, right? The end goal is to produce an area that is adequately deconflicted to offer for sale. And unfortunately, that has a lot to do with a whole bunch of things that are sometimes out of our control. So we try and do what we can to be as expeditious as possible. But for planning purposes, about a year and a half to two, I think, is probably what I'd answer to that.
And where does the money from a lease sale go? Does it get recycled into further investigations for new wind energy areas?
It goes to all of us. It goes to the Treasury. So it goes to the government as a whole.
Back to the general fund.
Yep. Yeah.
So how are, or will there be designated vessel lanes established, and by whom? So I think this question is in regard to setback distances. Does BOEM have jurisdiction there, or do you rely on other agencies? So who would determine a safe setback distance between navigation, maritime traffic, and turbines?
That's a great question. It really revolves around coordination with the experts in that field, which in this case is the United States Coast Guard. You really have to have an understanding of what the vessel traffic is in the area, and along with not only what is it historically, but what will it be in the future. And through the navigation safety risk assessment, you look at how will the impact of my projects, not only the operations of the project, but the construction of the project, impact maritime traffic. But in terms of the sort of the distance and setbacks, there are a series of formulas on more of an international level to account for specific vessels and specific vessel traffic activities that can help determine that. But ultimately, that's kind of a larger question. And if you look to the Northeast and the Massachusetts, Rhode Island wind energy areas, that was a large topic of conversation for several years. Coast Guard did a series of studies, and you ended up with a decision where you actually did not include transit lanes, so to speak, but you have a 1 nautical mile by 1 nautical mile grid that can facilitate travel within it.
All right. So in one of your slides, you showed the escalating price of leases. So one of the commenters is curious, what do you think happened between 2015 and 2018 that caused the market to drive up those prices so much? And adding to that, is BOEM concerned with lease auction prices and its ultimate impacts on the electrical offtake being undertaken by the states?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I'll offer my opinion. I can't necessarily speculate on exactly what developers are willing to pay or not willing to pay. I think that between the initial New York Bight sale in December 2016 to Equinor for $42 million and the December sale in 2018, there's a large, bit of momentum in the industry here through a lot of work NYSERDA has done and others to increase the certainty in these processes and also the certainty of or potential to purchase power. So a lot of states are specifically carving out certain goals for procuring offshore wind energy in order to meet larger renewable energy goals. And so essentially the market is forming. And there's only a certain number of players in that market. And as we offer more seats at the table, those seats become more valuable, the more foreseeable it is that you actually can make a profit and build a project. So That's why you had those large $135 million bids in December of 2018, or part of the reason why. And the way that our regulations and the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act is set up is we are required to obtain fair return for the resources that we offer. And fair return is very different than in the oil and gas realm, where you're asking for fair market value. And so what is fair return? There's less of a focus on the actual dollar amount. I think if you look at it from one perspective, BOEM is less concerned about the actual dollar amount that is gained from a sale, as long as it does meet that fair return. But I think you can get to a point at which you are offering so much money, or the sales go for so much money that they end up impacting the ability for those leases to be developed in an expeditious manner, which is part of our mandate as well. So there is a balance there, and BOEM does have a few tools to try and alter that, and it's something we've done in the past. For example, with that Massachusetts sale in 2018, we went out with a proposed sale notice and said we're offering 2 areas. They're big areas. We're offering 2 areas the same size as they were in 2015. And we had so much interest and comments from developers, and knew there'd be interest in it, knew there'd be a commercial interest in it. So, well, let's make it 3 areas instead of 2 to increase the competition and increase the number of folks available. So theoretically, that did decrease, increase supply. So it decreased the price a little bit there, but that's something we're very interested to get more feedback in, especially as we look towards future sales, and making sure that there's a balance between getting fair return and making sure that it's done in a manner that provides the expeditious development.
Yeah, I think it's a good indicator of a very robust industry with a great deal of competition, but of course it has implications on overall prices. So another question relating to the site assessment plan. So you stated the timeline for approval of a site assessment plan can range from 3 to 5 years. That 3 to 5 years is the work in which the developers are advancing an understanding of their individual sites. Is that timeline really predicated on a timeline set up by BOEM, or is it really something that developers are doing to understand their sites? And are there ways to improve the efficiency of that, either from a developer's perspective or from BOEM's perspective?
So I just want to clarify the timeline there. So the date that a lease is activated, so to speak, or when a lease is signed, you have a year from that date in order to submit your site assessment plan. And that's really a plan that documents how you're going to put a buoy out there or a tower. Once your site assessment plan is approved, there's a 5-year window to submit your construction operations plan. So once you submit your construction operations plan, it's generally once your construction operations plan is submitted and it's revised to the point that BOEM feels it's ripe for the NEPA review, and you can issue a notice of intent to conduct that review, that's a 2-year period to the completion of the environmental impact statement. So I think your question was generally about how to speed that up. Is that?
Yeah, are there opportunities to speed that process up, building efficiencies in the overall development timeline?
Yeah, I think it starts with some of the activities NYSERDA has done in order to try and develop the knowledge base of the lease areas themselves and get more information to inform the construction operations plan, so that you're not spending time doing surveys and surveys and surveys. As we learn more about what offshore wind looks like, and we do it more and more, efficiencies will be gained, but that's certainly a big focus, is just to try and make sure we're working as efficiently as possible.
All right, we're just about at time, so I'm going to finish off with one more question. So we know that cable connection to shore is not part of the lease process, but what is BOEM's thinking about facilitating shoreside connections and associated stakeholder development in your process?
So when we do offer a lease, the lease comes with an easement to be determined to shore on the federal Outer Continental Shelf. We do not have jurisdiction onshore or the interconnection site. That's something that is focused mostly on the states and the local level. I'd say that we do recognize that in order to end up with a situation where you have a large influx of offshore wind energy into the U.S. grid, there's a need for substantial upgrades, and the traditional manner of radial connections from one farm to shore is not an efficient route when you go at scale. So it's something that we're exploring to try and understand what exactly our role is and other players in the process.
Great. Hey, thank you, Luke, very much for your participation in our inaugural Learning from the Experts webinar. I think it was a really excellent overview of the BOEM process and mechanics. But again, thank you very much, and thank you everyone else for your participation as well. As a reminder, these slides are being recorded. This presentation has been recorded, and the presentation will be available on the NYSERDA website, probably starting early next week. And again, this is the first of a series of webinars that we're putting together. The next two are listed here. We're going to have one kind of on the technical aspect on April 7th, talking about Offshore Wind Technologies 101 with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And another one shedding a little light on New York State's Article 7 process for permitting offshore wind. And that's going to be by Representative Bill Flynn from Harris Beach, the law firm Harris Beach. You can register for these webinars by going to wind.ny.gov. And again, if you have suggestions or feedback on this presentation or future presentations, please reach out to us at the email address here, offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Thanks, Luke.